Welcome to Sparking Equity, a podcast highlighting promising strategies to ensure that all students succeed. I'm Lande Ajose, Managing Director at Waverly Street Foundation. In this episode, we will look at the critically important role that higher education institutions can play in tackling climate change. Before we get started, I want to extend our thanks to the sponsors of the podcast, the Hewlett Foundation and School Services of California. Without their support, this episode would not have been possible. Last year was the warmest year on record, and 2024 is set to be even hotter. Extreme weather events, from wildfires and droughts to floods and hurricanes, have increased in intensity and frequency. Sea levels are at a record high and rising. I was recently a member of the Higher Education Impact Task Force, convened by the Aspen Institute, to look into how higher education institutions can contribute to addressing climate change. I've asked two members of that task force to join us today. First, Eloy Oakley, President and CEO of the College Futures Foundation based in San Francisco. Many of you will know Eloy from his many years as a leader in the California community colleges, most recently as the chancellor of its 116 campus system. Welcome to Sparking Equity, Eloy.
Great to be with you, Lande.
And also with us is Jamie Marisotis, President and CEO of the Lumina Foundation, which is based in Indianapolis. Jamie, for those of you who don't know, was also the founder of the Institute for Higher Education Policy in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you, Lande. Great to be with you.
So, Jamie, let me start with you. How important would you say higher education's role is in combating climate change?
You know, at the end of the day, higher education has always been about many things. It's been about both knowledge transmission and knowledge development, and it covers a wide array of topics and issues. But I think that climate change is perhaps one of the most central topics higher education has ever tackled or will tackle as part of its mission. It's important for higher education to do so because it represents an existential threat to human existence. And if we think about the ways in which higher education historically has worked to sort of foster greater equity through the civil rights movement, or efforts by higher education to create large-scale change at a scientific level, this fits into the sort of broader mission of higher education to be the engine of social and economic progress for the nation, for the world, and addressing climate change, I think, is really important. And, you know, if we think about the ways in which higher education can do that, there's lots of ways to do it that we'll get into in this conversation. But I think most importantly, it's got to be core to what higher education does throughout its mission, how it acts in terms of its ongoing work. It's the teaching and learning function, the research function, how it behaves as a community member, and how it focuses in terms of its own internal operations. So all of those things, I think, are really important for higher education.
So that's super interesting. And I want to pivot to Eloy. Your foundation focuses on post-secondary student success. And can you give us an idea of how climate change could have an impact on the college students' experience?
Yes. Lande, if you think about it, the kinds of students that our foundation is focused on are underserved populations. Underserved populations live in communities throughout California and throughout the country that are most impacted by the consequences of climate change, yet they're the least able to have any control over those circumstances. And so we believe strongly that improving access and success in a post-secondary attainment for learners that are underserved, for learners that come from communities of color, low-income communities, struggling communities, gives them an opportunity to have greater influence over the conversation that's happening around them. Because most of the conversations, particularly over the last 20 years or so regarding climate change, have been very abstract to these communities. They've never felt like they have any control over it. So giving these learners more agency through the lever of post-secondary education, we believe, is a critical part of getting them to be more engaged, more aware in this conversation about climate change.
You know, one of the things that strikes me about this conversation is what you said about abstraction, and the climate crisis has really been an abstraction for most people. So I'm wondering, and maybe we'll start with you, Jamie, What are the salient and specific ways that higher education can really address a challenge that does seem so abstract to so many?
Some of this has to do with sort of basic blocking and tackling, right? Greater support for students to help them understand how in their own work, irrespective of what they're studying, climate change is a part of what they need to focus on. It has to be foundational to the programs of study, climate literacy, things like that. Deeper understanding of how climate is changing, how people live and work and thrive and grow. I also think that higher education can do more of that by engaging with the communities within which they're operating in order to better, again, connect the students and their families with the community members in terms of the work that they're doing to support broader actions. Someone said to me recently, are we still talking about saving the whales? I said, no, we're talking about a lot more than simply saving the whales. We're talking about saving humanity itself. And that's what I think is so important, is making that real for people and helping people who maybe have been on the sidelines of these conversations or haven't been a part of it, brought into the mainstream and actually connecting with the real work that needs to be done.
I think we're going to rename this episode Global Weirding. Eloy, let's go to you. Are there things that you think that higher education should be specifically focused on that we should be doing to take on the climate crisis?
First, the research that's done in our research universities and our applied research universities really has to be communicated in a more mainstream way. Part of the challenge here is this has been a conversation in the academy. This has been a conversation amongst policy elites for the most part over the years. This has got to be a mainstream conversation. So we've got to translate that great research that's been done that has given us greater insights into climate change to, we have to make this part of the economy, the opportunity economy for most people. So we talk a lot about jobs in the green economy. That's sometimes hard to translate into the lives of working Americans throughout this country. And I think clearly what, if anything, this last election showed us is that people have a lot of angst about the economy. So we have to connect this to their local economy, to communities, to neighborhoods. How is this fight against climate change going to actually give them an opportunity to thrive in the economy that's being created? And we haven't done a good enough job. Now, we have institutions like regional four-year universities, community colleges that are closest to everyday Americans, and we need to use those as a vessel to help inform and help connect people to this growing economy. It can't just be all about the doom and gloom that's coming. It has to be about how do they actually participate in the changes that need to happen, and that these changes aren't going to negatively impact them in the economy. So I think we have to do a better job of doing that. And I think particularly the broad access higher education institutions that are the backbone of the workforce have the greatest role in doing that.
Can I just plus one Eloy's point about both the policy elites and, frankly, the elite higher education institutions? Because I think this is part of the problem of that disconnect you're talking about, Lande, which is that this does seem abstract in part because it seems like something that the elites are worried about. And I think to a significant extent, to Eloy's point, to the ways in which we can bring it to the community colleges, which are in the communities, to historically Black colleges, to tribal colleges, to Hispanic serving institutions, to regional public four-year institutions, finding ways for them as institutions which are much more closely connected to their communities to connect with community members and make this less abstract, less elite, and more real. I just think it's a really, really good point, Eloy. And I think to the greatest extent possible, we have to push back on this idea. I mean, look, we need research universities to do research to help us really understand what's going on. That's super important. But this is not their purview. They are providing information to help us develop better strategies, which we need to implement in these communities. That's where the real action is going to take place.
Yeah, as someone who just made the jump from higher education to climate, I can't agree with you both more. What struck me as a newcomer to this work is that the climate folks end up speaking a lot with the climate folks, right? And so you end up perpetuating this sense of there's an inside conversation and then everyone else is trying to figure out what is going on and are only now taking notice because of a lot of these extreme weather events that we seem to be experiencing, the global weirding, if you will. I want to circle back to this comment about communities, because certainly at Waverly Street Foundation, we are starting with the premise that focusing at the local level, focusing on movement building, that's where the action needs to be, because that's what's going to sustain any policy wins that we are able to realize in this work. We know that low-income communities, particularly those that are disproportionately Black and Latino, are disproportionately affected by climate change. What are you seeing happening on the ground in terms of higher education institution reaching students of color and their local communities on this climate issue?
On one side, you see weather events happening throughout the country. I'm here in California. When we have huge rain events, these huge events where we get a lot of water all of a sudden, this is new to California, these atmospheric rivers that come just dump a ton of water. You see the low-income communities turn on their TVs and see a bunch of rich people's houses falling into the ocean. And people chuckle. They're not connecting this to their own lives. They're seeing this as something that's happening to wealthy people on the coast and not happening to them. But then on the other end, you see the impacts to their own communities, to their own neighborhoods. You see the rising costs of living, and in their local colleges and universities, they're starting to see more and more opportunities to get into jobs that are connected to this climate change phenomenon. So there is still a disconnect. We have to continue to bring those two sides together, help communities see that this is an impact that they need to be concerned about. Because look, for most of these communities, they're worried about crime, they're worried about the cost of living, they're worried about how they're going to educate their own children, where are they going to get a job, is AI going to take over their job? We need to continue to do a better job of connecting them to the importance of this issue and helping them find opportunities in the economy that benefit the climate change goals that we want to see happen. So we have to do a better job of that on the ground.
We all served as members of this task force. Some of our colleagues on the task force can really sort of help us with the amplification of this, right? So Walter Kimbrough, I think he's currently the interim president of Talladega College, been president of two other historically Black colleges before that. Catherine Wilkinson, who's co-founder of the All We Can Save Project. People who are really focused on the questions of equity and what's really happening in terms of the communities where these impacts are being most strongly felt. And in Catherine's case, doubling down on women and women of color as a particularly important part of the work here. The abstraction here is something that we worry about, right? Because it does seem distant and different. And this is not something that people still see as clearly as we would like. Though, as I said, I think they see it more clearly because there's more evidence in front of them, particularly from a weather perspective, about the potential impact. What's pretty clear from the climate models is that these things are going to be changing in an exponential rate. And as the exponential impacts start to happen, we're going to see the disproportionate impacts on these communities.
One starting place, it seems to me, with this is the institutions themselves. And we have organizations like Second Nature who are asking colleges and universities to sign a pledge towards prioritizing climate action by making commitments around carbon neutrality, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and, thinking about adaptation and improving community capacity to respond. Is this the right direction for colleges and universities to go? Is this the effective model for them?
I think it's one model. It's one step in the right direction. I know certainly, my time with the University of California is very active in this space. It has goals to become zero emitters. Students are very involved in the advocacy to improve policies and practices on all 10 of the campuses. So there is a lot of movement in that space, and that's important. The most important part of that is that younger generations of students are the ones carrying this message and demanding more and more and more, which is great. That's an important step. The second part of this is the public policy and the public investment side. If we want to see more done, we need, the University of California is one thing, but if you move down to the places where more low-income learners are actually attending regional public 4 years in your community colleges, they get less and less public investment to make the kinds of climate resilient changes that we need to make. They have to go out and find the funding from their own local bond measures. Those are the institutions that I think need the most support, because that then reaches the kinds of learners, the kinds of communities that we want to influence. Because if you think about a community college, if you have a major climate change triggered event, a flood, hurricane, tornado, community colleges are in the center of that community and can help that community understand not just how to recover from this, but how to become more resilient. And we need to give those institutions the tools to do that.
I do think pledges are good in the context of this kind of work, as long as the pledges have real action behind them. And I think a pledge is a good starting place. It's a good place to sort of state your values, commit to something. But then there's got to be action behind that. And I'm sorry to say that, we can point no further than what's happened in recent years around the kinds of pledges we saw, particularly in the corporate sector, around racial equity that quickly got unraveled in the last 18 months because of enormous political pressure, right? So pledges on their own aren't sufficient. It's transparency about how you're acting on those pledges that I think is really, really important.
Okay, Jamie, you brought up the P word, so let's get political. After the November 5th elections, it seems almost certain that we're entering a period where there will be much greater resistance to climate action. And at the same time, we're going to see increased attacks on higher education as centers of political indoctrination. And on the mere concept of equity, which the three of us believe in so deeply, I think that's going to intensify. That could complicate higher ed's ability to initiate new programs and new efforts along the lines that we've been talking about. So I'd be curious for both of you to talk about your sense of how higher education institutions are going to respond to those incredible pressures and those headwinds.
It's early days. It is very clear what the intent is. I mean, this is part of, again, to the conversation we were having a few minutes ago about the broader ways in which we are being whipsawed by the political environment and the real pain that people are feeling and the way in which they're responding by exercising their political votes in ways that don't make sense to some of us, but are things that we've got to respond to. So, but I think the macro trend here, which is that this is really populism, which is anti-institutionalism, which is consuming almost everything, right? So it's anti-government, it's anti-higher education, it's I think philanthropy is going to be in the crosshairs of this movement. It's trying to take down the hierarchy of military and lots of other things. So there's lots of institution structures that are being tackled, and higher education is clearly one of those. I think our challenge and our opportunity in higher education is this. The challenge is that we, in fact, do need to change. We know that. We've known that for a long time. And that includes, in particular, things like improving equity, increasing opportunity. But it also focuses on making sure that that opportunity leads to real outcomes for people. And those real outcomes have to be really clear. My point simply is this, that in the space of climate action, in the space of the way in which higher education is going to be attacked for its support for climate action, we have to be very clear about what we are for, not just what we are against, and being very clear about what we are for and why that is the case, what the impacts would be in following the path that we think is the right path, that's the path driven by facts and real information, not by inference and politics. I think that's going to be very important, not just in our work in climate action, by the way, but in general, which is being much clearer about what we are for. And I think if there's something that we probably need to do some introspection on in higher education, is that there have been times in which it felt like we were doing more ducking and covering than actually being clear about what we wanted to achieve. And so thinking about and acting upon climate action by saying, these are the steps that need to be taken, and here's why, and here's the outcomes. I think being clear about what we're for is going to be a very important part of our job going forward in higher education.
Eloy, what do you think? Are we going to be in a duck and cover moment, or are we going to take those steps?
I think we're going to be in a moment where we will have to see who are the leaders that are going to step up and think about ways to support that leadership. The leadership that will emerge, this is the leadership that emerged in previous administrations, is going to think about this opportunity set differently than in the past. We cannot duck and cover. We have to understand how we got here, what the voters are saying to us, and respond to that in this context of climate change. I mean, we already know we're fighting a disinformation situation in this country, but if you boil it down to the simplest issues, people's livelihoods, people's ability to raise their families, people's ability to afford a home, if you can boil it down to those things that people understand, then you stand a chance to emerge from this in a positive way. This can't be about elite institutions talking down to the American public. That's how we got here. This has got to be bottom-up approach of working in communities, getting them to not getting into the debate about, is this because we have too many cows out there? Is this because we have too many cars? But just getting down to the day-to-day things that impact their livelihood and working from there, and then trying to bubble up some solutions that are actually going to have an impact.
So, Eloy, you've brought up the critical question of leadership and who is willing and ready to step out there to be leaders in this work. And that brings the inevitable question of what the role of philanthropy is in all of this. All three of us work at foundations. What do you think philanthropy should be doing in this space at this moment, given the context that we're in?
Well, I would just say this, that in my view, philanthropy's role is to give support and cover to leaders who are being most effective at making the change, and then to highlight what those leaders are doing and to share that information with as many people as possible. Really create an environment where we are rewarding and supporting leaders who are doing the things that need to be done in communities throughout this country. I think that's a key role for philanthropy. That's at least the way we're approaching it here in California for College Futures.
Yeah, I would say a yes and on that point, Eloy, because I think we are also leadership organizations ourselves. And I think part of the leadership that we have to exercise, in addition to being the fuel for the leaders, the cover that you're talking about, clean energy, by the way, if I'm saying fuel, it's clean energy. It's solar energy. But I think the point is that we are also leadership organizations. And one of the things I'm proud of that the three of us said together is it doesn't matter what your mission is in philanthropy, whether you've got a broad mission, you're covering lots of different topics, you're very focused. We all happen to be running foundations that are more narrowly focused on specific topics. All of us should be thinking about and acting upon the ways in which climate change is going to impact our work. So if you work in poverty, if you work in social justice, if you work in higher education, like we all have done, et cetera, we all need to think about the ways in which we need to incorporate climate action into our work. We are not all climate funders. There are funders that are very good at funding climate work, but it is a part and parcel of what we need to be doing as funders, because at the end of the day, philanthropy is society's risk capital. We take risk that others can't. And in pursuing large-scale social change, systemic change, which is what many foundations are focused on, we've got to take the risk here that the investments we're making aren't sort of Pyrrhic victories, that they're simply leading to sort of very narrow outcomes. We've got to think about the broader impact of the work that we're doing, and we've got to think about the broader context within which we're working. And from where I sit, things like climate change and authoritarianism, these are existential threats to human existence. And we have to be focused on these issues in our work at Lumina Foundation because it's too important not to be involved.
Thank you for that. And I would just echo from the Waverly Street Foundation perspective that climate funders also need to get out of their own way and understand the points of connection with all of these other bodies of work. It is not enough to simply fund climate policy. We need to think about how do we fund narrative change so that more people, apropos Eloy's comments, understand at a very visceral level what this crisis means and how they can be engaged. What is it that we need to do to support movement building so that we actually are building power to actually sustain a lot of the wins that we've had in the past? And what is it that we need to do to actually amplify the solutions that already are taking place in communities and on the ground, so that we're not coming in as the experts, but that we're coming in as people who understand communities and how we can help scale and amplify things that people already are doing, because it is, as Eloy said, about those lives and livelihoods. And that's the place to start with this debate. One final question before we wrap, and because I don't want to end on a sour note, I'd be curious to start with you, Eloy, and then go to you, Jamie. Tell me what gives you hope in this moment as you think about higher education, climate change, the political moment that we're in.
I'm the parent of a 16-year-old, a junior in high school, and she knows more about climate change and sustainability than I do. She is that Gen Z generation that is giving me a lot of hope, a lot of sense of promise for the future. They look at what's come before them and they see what we've screwed up. And they are very determined in a way that we've actually been doing research on this at Lumina Foundation. We think that the perspectives that this generation, Gen Z, is bringing to their role in the world is more similar to the greatest generation, to the generation before ours. And I think that's pretty exciting to think about that generation, World War II and all those things and all the things that they endured. I think this generation is similarly minded when it comes to their role in impacting the future. And that gives me a lot of hope.
What gives me hope is generations that are a lot younger than me. They're not just consuming information from the right or the left. They're trying to build a movement of their own. That gives me hope, because ultimately they're the ones who will decide our future, not us here on this podcast. I mean, we've already screwed things up enough. They will decide our future. People may look at this election and say, but some of them voted differently than I would have expected them to. No, they voted in ways or didn't vote in ways that made sense to them. And I think that they're the ones who speak most clearly about what kind of future they want to see. And so that gives me hope.
On that hopeful note, we'll need to wrap up this conversation, but I want to start by thanking our guests, Eloy Ortiz Oakley, President and CEO of the College Futures Foundation, and Jamie Marisotis, President and CEO of the Lumina Foundation. Thank you both.
Thank you, Lande.
Thank you.
Thanks to our producer, Kobe McDonald, and to Eric Olson for helping out with the recording. Thanks again to our sponsors, the Hewlett Foundation and School Services of California. Please let us know of other innovative higher education initiatives taking on the climate challenge at sparkingequity@gmail.com. And be sure to sign up for Sparking Equity wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Lande Ajose. Thanks for listening.